Okay, everybody, thank you for coming to today's session. I make it 22, so I will make a start so we can finish promptly. My name is Paul Chandler. I lead NHS England's Net Zero Travel and Transport team. I spoke a bit earlier about the broader Greener NHS programme and the broader work streams. And this afternoon I'm going to talk to you in a bit more detail about travel and transport. What we know about NHS travel and transport, what some of the solutions might be to decarbonise that pretty major source of carbon and air pollutant emissions. I will try and leave some time at the end for some questions, but if I don't get round to you, then I'll also put up my contact details and you are very welcome to contact my team. I'll also show you where you can find some of the resources that we've been developing that might help you or your colleagues as well. What I'm going to cover in today's session is firstly the scale of the challenge of reaching net zero travel and transport emissions for the NHS overall. Then talk about decarbonising emergency fleets. They're right at the most complex end of the spectrum for pretty much any road travel anywhere in the world, and the NHS is playing a global leadership role in that endeavour. Then I'll talk a bit about hospital trust fleets, which might be a bit more relevant to most of the people in the audience today, and also talk a bit about rethinking business travel and how we might tackle that and make that healthier and more effective for staff who do need to travel for business purposes. So firstly, this is our carbon footprint for NHS travel and transport, taken in 2019. We are just about to release an update on that, but it's not ready yet, so I can't share that with you. Ultimately, travel and transport in the NHS contributes 4.3 million tonnes of carbon every year. You might remember from my talk earlier that the total direct carbon emissions for the NHS are 6.1 million tonnes, travel and transport 4.3 million tonnes, so almost two-thirds equivalent to almost two-thirds of the direct carbon footprint of the entire NHS, so a big deal. And you can see there broken down into different buckets, biggest ones being patient travel and staff commuting. I'll talk a bit about those today, but I'll be focusing mainly on our fleet and business travel for the purposes of this presentation. So, first up, emergency ambulances. This, as I mentioned, is a very difficult fleet segment to decarbonise, and the NHS are leading the way globally in this regard. Why are they so difficult to decarbonise? Well, there's a range of reasons. Firstly, they're very heavy, specialist vehicles. You need to build them up. You can't just go and buy an ambulance off the conveyor belt. So it's got a lot of equipment in the back, clinical equipment, heating, cooling, ventilation. All of that needs electrical power. In a diesel ambulance, you can simply turn the engine on. The alternator will charge those systems for you. In an electric ambulance, you're not going to have an alternator, so you'll need to build in enough power, not just to drive the vehicle, but to power all that equipment in the back as well. Ambulances can be on the same or outside EDs for several hours at a time, so you're talking about a lot of electrical power that you'll need to generate through the traction battery. Ambulances have a really broad geographical spread. You never quite know where a lot of them are going to be, particularly those ambulances that service rural areas. If you've got an ambulance in London or Manchester or Leeds, they're likely to stay roughly within the city confines. But if you're talking about rural Derbyshire or Yorkshire, then they could travel a massive distance and a massive area. You never know where they're going to end up from one day to the next. So we need ambulances capable of doing that and a refuelling infrastructure that can keep pace with what ambulances need to do. And needless to say, ambulances need to be ready instantly for the next call. We can't say, oh, sorry, can you wait for half an hour, we'll charge the ambulance up, we'll be with your heart attack in about 3/4 of an hour. They need to be ready for that next call, which means that we'll need to charge the ambulances when they're stopped for other reasons. We can't schedule them in and say, oh, between 12 and 1 we'll charge the ambulance. They'll need to charge when they're stopped at ambulance stations to restock and refuel for meal breaks. For when they're outside EDs handing patients over, that's when these ambulances will need to refuel. So they'll need to have a refueling infrastructure that is flexible to meet those needs. We've taken a data-led approach to determining what the emergency fleet will need in terms of decarbonisation based on 4 steps. Firstly, we've used telematics data to understand in really granular terms what emergency ambulances do. And there's a few surprises in that have surprised us. They've surprised some of the ambulance trusts as well, but the data's pretty rock solid. I'll show you some of that in a moment. We've then worked out how much energy, electrical energy, those ambulances need to generate, not, as I talked about, not just to drive the miles that the vehicle needs to travel, but for all of that equipment used in the All the telematics systems will tell us how regularly the defib is on, how often the heating is on, how often the ignition is on or off, and we've used that data to build up a really good detailed picture of that. We then need to think about the vehicle development. It's all well and good saying, sure, we'll have an electric ambulance, but do the vehicles exist out there? Do we have the capability? Do the base vehicles exist that will give us the range that we'll need for emergency vehicles? And then we also need to think about the refueling infrastructure as well, as I've talked about. So the telematics data has thrown up a few surprises. I don't intend you to read that data on the graph, but just to say that we've got really detailed telematics data for 5 of the 10 ambulance trusts. And what that's shown us is a bit surprising. So emergency ambulances, on average, if you can conceptualise such a thing, only travel about 92 miles a day as a mean average. Now, there's no such thing as a mean average ambulance. There's no such thing as a mean ambulance day, but just as an indication, 92 miles as a mean average. The 95th percentile is 186 miles. So only the 5% busiest ambulances in the whole of the country do more than 186 miles a day routinely. So this busts a few myths. When we talk to ambulance services, they say, of course, we've got ambulances that go between Newcastle and Whitehaven, and that's 300 miles. We need ambulances that are all capable of doing that. Our data shows that's pretty rare that happens. We do need to think about that, and we do need a small proportion of the fleet to be able to do that, but it's certainly nowhere near all ambulances. In terms of the technology generation, the NHS is leading the way globally. We had the first electric emergency ambulance anywhere in the world, developed by West Midlands Ambulance Service in 2020. Can do about 120 miles on a single charge, but it was very, very expensive to build. They basically took a diesel ambulance, they stripped out the engine and put an electric drivetrain. They also put in a lot of bespoke specialist electronic systems to be able to get that range up to 120 miles on a single charge. That vehicle costs about 400 grand to build. A diesel ambulance will cost you about 85, so it's not a viable financial solution, but it does show the technology exists to do that. What we're doing now is building a second generation electric ambulance. We're building 13 this year with 5 ambulance trusts. They'll be built on an electric van chassis, so they are much, much cheaper to build than taking a diesel vehicle and retrofitting that. They'll still be more expensive than a diesel ambulance. They'll probably be about £30,000 to £35,000 per unit more expensive than a diesel. But you will save that money 2 or 3 times during the lifetime of the vehicle on fuel savings and maintenance savings. So if the NHS can afford to invest that capital up front, those ambulances will actually be cheaper to own and operate overall. Based on our analysis, we think that those second generation ambulances, based on the mileage and usage data that we've got, we're pretty confident they could replace up to 80% of the current diesel ambulance fleet, but only if we build the refueling infrastructure in the right places and the right quantities. As we mentioned, these vehicles will need to charge when they're stopped for other reasons, which will mean that the charging will need to go into every ambulance station. There's well over 1,000 of those at the moment in the UK, and probably outside every Type 1 ED as well, and there's around 500 of those locations as well. So we do need a heavy-duty refueling infrastructure, at least a refueling infrastructure in many different locations for this to be viable as we move forward. The technology is going to move on really, really quickly, so in the next kind of 5 or 6 years, we'll anticipate the 3rd generation electric ambulance being available. That would have a bigger battery, be much cheaper to buy as well as the technology improves and unit costs fall. These will be cheaper than a diesel ambulance, and will be able to do about 200 miles on a single charge. So people are asking us, why are you messing around with electric ambulances? Aren't they expensive? Aren't they unviable? Well, we need to start building the experience of those now, so that when the technology becomes mainstream, when it becomes more affordable and more viable, we're in a position to roll them out pretty quickly. We'll then need to calculate the refueling infrastructure that we'll require for 100% emergency fleet. And again, the results that we got really surprised me and really surprised lots of people. When we embarked on this work, I thought, well, you're just going to need dozens of the most ultra-rapid EV chargers that you've got on the market in every location, so that those vehicles can charge up as quickly as is possible and they can be on their way. But when we started to dig into the data, we found that wasn't necessary. Actually, we found when we started to look at energy consumption, every time an ambulance stops at an ambulance station or an ED, we calculated how much electrical energy that would have used since its last stop at an ambulance station or an ED. We found that actually the mean average was 15 kilowatts of energy that an ambulance was using, so quite a modest amount of electricity that they would need to replace every time they stopped at an ED or an ambulance station. And then when we had to consider multiple vehicles. Of course, an ED doesn't just have 1 or 2 ambulances outside it. At peak times, it could have 15 or 20. So how do we multiply that up to make sure the refueling infrastructure is sufficient to deal with multiple vehicles in single locations? But what we actually found is that the charging capacity that we required was much, much lower than we previously anticipated. We certainly still need EV charging in lots of different locations. As I said, every ambulance station, every Type 1 ED is likely to need EV refueling of some sort or another, but that you're not going to need all of those ultra-rapid charges. We found that over 70% of times where ambulances need to recharge, they could have reached 100% battery capacity within the charging time available on a 22 kilowatt hour charge or less. So the likely solution will be what we call a DC power bank. You'll have like a big battery which is capable of providing 200 kilowatts of power, and then multiple chargers that will vary that charge to the vehicles as they need them. The total cost, the capital costs of buying the chargers and installing them is likely to be about £65 million, which is quite a big figure, but when you consider that we'll be servicing 4,500 ambulances in 1,500 different locations, and that investment will be spread over 10 years or more, we certainly think that's a viable investment for the NHS to make. I should also say that investment is unlikely to come from individual trusts and individual ambulance trusts. This investment is likely to be made by integrated care boards from the capital allocations that they are given over the next 10 or 12 years. And those capital allocations run into the billions of pounds each year. So it's certainly possible for integrated care boards to make these investments and to coordinate those installations. It's not all about emergency ambulances though. About 2,000 emergency vehicles on road are not double crewed ambulances. They're other types of emergency response vehicle, rapid response cars, like you see there on the picture. Mental health ambulances, which aren't designed to convey patients in an emergency, but are more designed to give urgent mental health care to those patients. We've been trialling 21 of those fully electric vehicles in different parts of the country, and it's been wildly successful overall. So much so that 2 ambulance services, London and North West Ambulance, based on the early experience they've had with those electric emergency vehicles, have between them have purchased 130 additional electric vehicles for these roles. So once we've got the vehicles in, we've dealt with the teething problems, we've built some fairly modest refueling infrastructure. Ambulance trusts have loved them and have now starting to think about those as their default option, which is great to see. We're also purchasing 90 new mental health ambulances at NHS England level. Over 70% of those will be fully electric as well. So it is absolutely possible. It's not something niche. It's not something that's going to happen in 10 or 15 years' time. For these emergency vehicles that aren't double crewed ambulances, the transition is already happening and happening pretty rapidly. There's lots of other things that we need to think about. It's not just saying, oh, the vehicle exists and, we've worked out how much charging infrastructure you need. Good luck to you. There's a lot of detailed support that NHS England will be giving to ambulance trusts around data, around working out electrical upgrade feasibility and costs, thinking about how you might need to change the way that ambulance services dispatch vehicles to different jobs, staff rotas, contingency planning, all of those kind of things. A very detailed undertaking to move from a diesel fleet to an emergency ambulance fleet that's electric. But we're supporting those ambulance trusts actively there. Why am I telling you all of this? Well, because lots of the things that we're working with ambulance fleets at the cutting edge things will be applicable to hospital trusts as well, and then they come to start decarbonising their fleets. If we can decarbonise emergency vehicles with all of the complexities that I've talked about here, we can certainly decarbonise hospital fleets as well. In terms of the hospital fleets, we've collected information over a couple of years now, and we've got a fairly good understanding of what the vehicles are and what they do. This is the secondary care fleet data from 2021. Overall, 207 hospital trusts between them own about 14,500 vehicles. You can see the breakdown there on the chart. There's only 4% of those vehicles are larger than a small van. So these are cars, small vans, SUVs. There's already a very wide choice of electric vehicles available to replace these. Most of those vehicles will do 250, 300 miles on a single charge. They are more expensive to buy at the moment than diesel and petrol cars, but by 2026, 2027, they will be cheaper to buy than a new petrol or diesel car. And they're already much, much cheaper to fuel and maintain. So increasingly, electric vehicles will become the default logical option for hospital trusts when they are thinking about replacing their vehicles. We also found when we collected the data that most of these vehicles that hospitals own do very few miles. In fact, we found that half of these vehicles did 150 miles or less per week, so 30 miles a day or less. Some a lot less than 30 miles a day. 95% of the vehicles did 96 miles a day or less. So range really isn't an issue for these vehicles. New electric vehicles, as I said, 250, 300 miles on a single charge. So range is not an issue when you're thinking about replacing these vehicles with electric, nor is choice of models, as we've seen there. The vast majority of these vehicles can be replaced by electric models as well. And also, these vehicles, where the cost comes is as a cost premium to buy electric vehicles, and you would also need to purchase and install the refuelling infrastructure, which can be quite expensive in some scenarios. What we know about secondary care fleets, though, is that most of those are used just during office hours. They're usually off the road for 12 hours a day or more, usually overnight, usually parked up on hospital allocation. And what that means is you can charge them up really cost effectively on a very low powered charge, a 3.57 kilowatt hour charge. And what that means is that you're unlikely to need to upgrade your electricity supply. You're unlikely need to upgrade your cabling. You're unlikely to need a grid reinforcement to be able to electrify your fleets, because you'll be charging these vehicles at very low power when things like your operating theatres, when your outpatients, when your offices are using next to no power really. So there are some scare stories out there about, well, if you need electric vehicles, you're going to need to upgrade your grid, you need to going to redo all of your cabling, all of these things. For most hospital trusts, you won't need to do that. The other thing to say is that because the vehicles do so few miles and will only need to charge up 1 day a week, maybe 2 days a week, you can have multiple vehicles sharing a charger. So if you've got a fleet of, say, 30 vehicles, you're not going to need 30 EV chargers. You might need 10 or 12, ultimately, which becomes a bit more cost effective as well. We're not expecting trusts to work their way through this alone. There will be a range of guidance that we are providing to NHS organisations about how to go about this, costing models, frameworks, process maps about how you tackle this particular challenge. But we certainly think it is viable. So much so, actually, that the NHS England are likely to set out a roadmap pretty soon about when we'd expect trusts to start moving to electric vehicles. I'll talk about that in a moment. We are developing this stepwise approach that we will provide to NHS, probably on our future NHS platform, which will just talk NHS organisations step by step through the process and through the obstacles of moving to an electric fleet. Firstly, you should audit your daily vehicle usage. You'll probably find what I've told you here. Lots of your vehicles are hardly used at all. Do you need all of those vehicles? If you've got 30 vehicles and they're all doing 30 miles or less per day, do you need all of those vehicles? Can you actually right-size your fleet by saying we'll have fewer vehicles overall and they can be shared from multiple teams? Won't be possible for everyone, but will certainly be possible in a number of scenarios. Then when you come to replace your vehicles, we're not saying you've just bought a petrol or diesel car, please replace it with an electric one next year. What we're saying is when that vehicle comes to the end of its lease or when it comes to the end of its useful life, please think about having an electric car as well. Don't just do it in the environment. It will reduce carbon emissions, it will reduce air pollution, but it will probably save you a lot of money as well in fuel and maintenance. And as I said, in 3 or 4 years' time, these vehicles will be cheaper to buy than petrol or diesel, so start thinking about that quite soon. And also think about the ownership model. Do you need to own those vehicles yourself? Can you lease them? Can you run a pool car system where with apps that takes that kind of that hassle about vehicle utilisation away from you? You could have a pool of cars that are available to your staff during the day and available to the general public at night. You don't own those vehicles, you don't have to deal with any of the admin. You can reduce the costs of owning a fleet and increase the flexibility. And then, as I said, plan refuelling infrastructure access. We're not going to leave trusts alone to do that. There will be a lot of guidance already out there and some that we're developing that will help steps follow that in a stepwise fashion. But we're not being particularly ambitious here in the NHS. Every single central government department has already committed to having a zero emission fleet by 2027. That's every single vehicle that they own. Now, there must be some derogations there because I can't see the MOD making that, but so there will be some tinkering around the edges. But every single vehicle in central government department by 2027. What we're considering is saying to the NHS by 2027, every time you come to replace a vehicle, it should be electric unless you can demonstrate really clearly why that can't be the case. If we can do it for ambulances, we can do it for emergency vehicles. We can certainly do it for pool cars and estates and facilities, vans and other types of vehicle. All right, just going to finish off with a bit on business travel, because from that previous slide, business travel emissions are about 3 times the emissions of the total NHS fleet that are owned and operated across the NHS, including all ambulances. So it's a big source of carbon and air pollution. We've started collecting NHS business travel through the NHS business expenses systems. And what we found, probably unsurprisingly, is that almost all business travel journeys in the NHS that are claimed for through the expenses system are made in cars. Well over 95%, in fact, are made by cars, and most of those journeys are single occupancy. We know that because if you carry passengers in your business travel, you can claim a different rate for that. So we're pretty confident over 95% of business travel emissions in the NHS single occupancy cars. That's not sustainable if we are going to meet our carbon and air pollution targets. Most 2/3 of that business travel is done in what we call grey fleets. They are vehicles that are owned individually by staff but are used for business purposes. So it might be a consultant that does a ward round in the morning at one of your hospitals, does an outpatient clinic in the afternoon at the hospital, and uses their car to travel between the two, ranging all the way up to district nurses who use their own car to go and visit dozens of patients a week. All of that counts as grey fleets. We've estimated 242 million miles are done in NHS grey fleets across 95,000 vehicles. But each of those individual vehicles aren't really doing that much mileage. The median average is 604 miles a year, or 12 miles a week. Lots and lots of individual vehicles, often quite old, quite polluting vehicles, doing a handful of miles each a week, probably going across hospital sites or to a handful of locations. What can we do to tackle that? That's quite an expensive way for NHS to provide business travel as well, at 56 pence per mile. Normally it's 59 pence a mile as it is now ultimately. What we'll be looking at within our net zero travel and transport strategy are 3 strands to business travel. Firstly, how do we eliminate unnecessary travel? We've all, lots of us work from home now, lots of us are used to using Teams for meetings. How do we embed that? How do we use digital healthcare, digital monitoring to not require a nurse to go and visit a patient and take their blood pressure or their blood glucose? How can we eliminate those journeys by using telemedicine, etc.? How do we replace short journeys with sustainable travel alternatives? I'm not recommending that a district nurse gets on 8 different buses to go and see their patients, but in certain cities, certain places, we're replacing short car journeys with things like e-bikes. And actually the staff that have been involved in that generally quite like that. Probably a different story if it's lashing it down with rain, but they like the freedom, they like the fact they don't have to find 10 different car parking spaces to outside their patients' house. So it can work in some scenarios. And then some high mileage travellers, how do we support them to access electric vehicles through salary sacrifice schemes, pool cars, those kind of things? And it is possible. It's pretty niche at the moment, but it is possible, and some trusts are delivering some really good results. Just finish on 2 case studies. One is the Leicester Bus Hopper service, which you may have heard about. Leicester was spending hundreds of thousands of pounds a year simply paying for their staff to drive or get taxis between their 3 main hospital sites. What they decided a few years ago is that they'd replace those journeys between sites with a shuttle bus service. Ultimately does a loop through various locations in Leicester, including the 3 main hospitals. Free for NHS staff. Partner organisations like universities are charged a small fee billed directly to that organisation, and the public can pay a small fee to travel on that bus service as well. Patients can use the bus for free to in certain scenarios. All the buses are fully electric. They don't own the buses, they're operated by a third party, but all of the buses are fully electric, so zero emissions, zero air pollutants at the tailpipe. And actually this service, even though it runs every half an hour, is cheaper for Leicester to run than it was all of the travel expenses they were paying between those sites at 56-59 pence a mile. So they're not cheap to run, shuttle bus service, but in this scenario and in many scenarios, they'll be cheaper than the alternative. And then Norfolk Community Pool Cars redesigned their pool car service with Knowles Fleet, who procured the vehicles and leased them to them, and Hirecar, who provided a booking app which takes all of the headache out of having a fleet of cars for the trust. They had a number of, like we've talked about, a number of pool cars that were barely used. When they relet the contract, they were able to reduce the size of their pool fleet by 30%, and that's a direct saving to the trust. For the remaining vehicles, through using the app, we're able to make sure the vehicles we use about 60% of the time of working hours. So it's really driving up that utilisation of those pool cars, best value for money. And it meant that staff who they couldn't necessarily recruit or retain because they couldn't afford to own their own vehicles for trust business are now able to reliably use a pool car to conduct their business travel. So that's it really from me.